The scent of roasted sage and brown butter hung heavy over the dining table, masking the bitter tension in the room. The crystal water goblets caught the warm glow of the chandelier, the same chandelier Arthur and I had picked out at an antique market 30 years ago. "To family," my son Mark said, raising his glass. He wore a perfectly tailored shirt, looking so much like his father that a dull, familiar ache pressed against my ribs. Next to him, Chloe offered her practiced, camera-ready smile. Her parents, sitting across from us, nodded in polite agreement, unaware of the ground they were standing on. "To family," Chloe echoed, her voice sugary sweet, "and to Evelyn for being so accommodating." My fingers rested on my lap, tracing the crisp, sharp edge of the thick manila envelope hidden beneath my linen napkin. A few months ago, sitting at this table, my hands would have trembled. I would have made excuses for them. I would have swallowed my pride just to keep the peace. But today, my palms were entirely dry. My breathing was steady, rhythmic. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a strange, hollow clarity, like a house completely emptied of its furniture. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the soft jazz playing in the background. I pulled the envelope from my lap and placed it directly on top of Chloe's expensive, custom-ordered charger plate. "I have something for you, Chloe. For both of you." Chloe's perfectly groomed eyebrows arched. She exchanged a quick, triumphant look with Mark, likely assuming it was the deed to the property or a check for their down payment. She eagerly tore the flap open and pulled out the single sheet of thick legal paper. I watched her eyes scan the first line. The color drained from her face so fast she looked as though she might faint. The polite smile fractured, then shattered completely. But to understand how a mother hands her only child a 30-day eviction notice during Thanksgiving dinner, you have to rewind the clock. You have to go back to May, back when this house was still a sanctuary, and my biggest worry was whether the hydrangeas would survive the late frost. Back then, my life was quiet. Perhaps a little too quiet since Arthur passed. I spent my days in the garden, volunteering at the local library, and enjoying the deep, resonant silence of a home that belonged entirely to me. Every creaking floorboard, every scuff mark on the oak staircase held a memory. Then came the phone call. "Mom, the housing market is a nightmare right now," Mark had said, his voice carrying that subtle, boyish pitch he always used when he needed a favor. "Our lease is up. Chloe found this amazing property, but we need to save up a bit more for the down payment. Just 6 months, Mom. Can we stay with you? We won't be in your way." I should have listened to the tight knot that formed in my stomach. A mother's intuition is rarely wrong, even when her heart tries to override it. But he was my son. My only boy. How could I say no to my own flesh and blood? They arrived on a rainy Tuesday with 30 boxes and an energy that immediately swallowed all the oxygen in the house. I had spent 2 days preparing the guest suite, airing out the linens, and buying Chloe's favorite oat milk and organic snacks. I wanted everything to be perfect. Within 48 hours, the subtle shifts began. I walked into my kitchen on Thursday morning to make my usual pot of Earl Grey, only to find the pantry completely reorganized. My baking supplies were shoved to the highest unreachable shelf, replaced by neat rows of protein powders and imported teas. "Oh, Evelyn, good morning," Chloe had said, not looking up from her phone as she leaned against the marble counter. She never called me Mom, which was fine, but the way she said my name always felt like a gentle reprimand. "I hope you don't mind. I just optimized the kitchen. It was getting a little cluttered in there, and you know how easy it is to forget expiration dates at your age?" I stood there, the cool ceramic of my favorite mug pressing into my palm. It was a tiny thing. A pantry. A misplaced bag of flour. But it felt incredibly violating. I liked it the way it was, I managed to say, forcing a polite smile. "Well, change is good," she chirped, patting my shoulder as she walked past me. "We have to keep you sharp." I let it slide. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, a grumpy old woman stuck in her ways. I made excuses for her behavior every single day for 3 weeks. Until the evening I was watering the ferns on the back porch. The living room window was open just a crack. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But the house was quiet, and Chloe's voice carried clearly over the sound of the evening crickets. She was on the phone. No, she's physically fine for now," Chloe was saying, her tone sharp, stripped of all that sugary sweetness. "But we need to speed up the timeline. I cannot live in this museum for another year, and honestly, she's getting so forgetful anyway. We're meeting with the attorney on Friday to draft the paperwork. A heavy silence followed as she listened to the person on the other end. Exactly, Chloe laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Once Mark has the power of attorney, we can finally put this massive place on the market. She doesn't need all these empty rooms. I stopped pouring the water. The watering can slipped from my hands, the water spilling over my gardening shoes, soaking through my socks. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My own son. The water from the dropped watering can seeped through my canvas shoes, chilling my toes, but I barely felt it. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears, drowning out the evening crickets. I stood frozen on the porch, staring at the painted floorboards. Power of attorney. Put this massive place on the market. The words echoed in my mind, sharp and jagged. I wanted to storm inside. I wanted to tear open the screen door, march into the living room, and demand an explanation. I wanted to scream at Chloe until my voice gave out, and then I wanted to look my son in the eye and ask him how he could let this happen. But 35 years of marriage to a fiercely pragmatic man had taught me one crucial lesson. Never walk into a negotiation, or a war, without leverage. If I confronted them now, based on half of an overheard phone conversation, Chloe would spin it. She would look at Mark with those wide, innocent eyes, place a manicured hand on his chest, and say, "Oh, honey, your mother is just confused. I was talking about my friend's house." And Mark, my sweet, easily manipulated Mark, would believe her. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the air past the tight restriction in my chest. I picked up the watering can, placed it neatly next to the geraniums, and walked inside. "Everything all right out there, Evelyn?" Chloe called out from the sofa. She was scrolling through her tablet, a glass of Chardonnay resting on the coaster beside her. "Perfectly fine," I said, my voice remarkably steady. Just a bit of a chill in the air. That night, sleep was entirely impossible. I lay in the dark, watching the shadows of the oak tree branches dance across the ceiling. For the next week, I became a ghost in my own home. I watched. I listened. And I noticed the subtle, insidious ways Chloe was laying the groundwork for her narrative. It started with small things. My reading glasses, which I always left on the nightstand, disappeared. I spent an hour looking for them, feeling a creeping sense of frustration. "Are you looking for these?" Chloe asked later that afternoon, holding them up. "I found them in the refrigerator, Evelyn, next to the butter." I stared at her. "I didn't put them there." Chloe offered a look of deep, patronizing pity. "It's okay. We all get a little forgetful. My grandmother used to do things like that all the time before. Well, before she had to move into the care facility." My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. She planted them. It was a brilliant, terrifyingly simple tactic. Make me doubt my own mind. Make Mark doubt my mind. 2 days later, my monthly bank statement vanished from the mail pile on the console table. When I asked Mark if he had seen it, Chloe chimed in from the kitchen. "You threw a bunch of papers in the recycling bin yesterday, Evelyn. Remember? You said you were decluttering." Mark looked at me, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. "Mom, are you feeling okay lately? You've been a little scattered." "I am perfectly fine, Mark," I replied, perhaps a little too sharply. I saw Chloe smirk behind his back as she poured her coffee. I realized then that I was playing on a ticking clock. I needed concrete evidence of their plan before they convinced my son I was unfit to live alone. The opportunity came on a Thursday afternoon. Mark was at the office, and Chloe had announced she was going to a Pilates class, followed by a late lunch with friends. As soon as I heard her car pull out of the driveway, I moved. I didn't bother with her bedroom. She was too careful for that. I went straight to Arthur's old study. Mark had been using it as a home office since they moved in. The room smelled faintly of Arthur's old pipe tobacco and Mark's expensive cologne, a sickening combination. I sat at the heavy mahogany desk and began opening drawers. Office supplies, charging cables, old receipts. Nothing out of the ordinary. I checked the search history on the shared family desktop. Mostly sports scores and furniture catalogs. Frustration prickled at the back of my neck. Maybe I had misunderstood the phone call. Maybe the paranoia was getting to me. I was about to leave the room when a flash of bright blue caught my eye. It was peeking out from beneath the heavy leather desk blotter. I carefully lifted the edge of the leather. There, hidden flat against the wood, was a thick manila folder. It had no label. My fingers felt stiff, almost wooden, as I pulled it out and flipped it open. The first document was a printed email from a law firm downtown. The subject line read, "Draft, Petition for Conservatorship. Evelyn Hayes. I didn't need to read the legal jargon to understand what I was holding. Attached to the email was a medical brochure outlining the symptoms of early-onset dementia, with specific behaviors highlighted in yellow marker. Next to the highlights, in Chloe's neat, looping handwriting, were notes. Put glasses in fridge, Tuesday. Hide mail, Thursday. They weren't just planning to take my house. They were meticulously scripting my descent into madness. And then, underneath the brochure, I saw the second document. It was a preliminary appraisal of my property. But it wasn't the numbers that made my breath catch. It was the signature on the bottom of the request form. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the property appraisal request. I blinked, hoping the letters would rearrange themselves, hoping my aging eyes were simply playing a cruel trick on me. But they weren't. The signature was written in a familiar, slightly slanted scrawl. Mark David Hayes. It was the exact same handwriting I had spent hours helping him perfect at the kitchen table when he was 7 years old. I remember guiding his small hand, teaching him how to loop the M and cross the T. Now that same hand had signed a document designed to strip me of my independence and my home. A profound, suffocating weight settled over my chest. The air in Arthur's old study suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I didn't cry. There was no sudden outburst of tears. Instead, a deep, hollow numbness spread from the center of my stomach outward, chilling my fingertips. It felt as though a vital cord tethering me to the world had just been cleanly snipped. Chloe's manipulation I could understand. I was just an obstacle to her, a stepping stone to a bigger bank account and a nicer zip code. But Mark, I had carried him. I had sat up through nights of fever, celebrated every clumsy milestone, and emptied my savings to pay for his college tuition so he wouldn't start his adult life in debt. He hadn't just been manipulated, he had agreed to this. He had signed his name. The sound of a car door slamming outside snapped me back to the present. Chloe was home from her Pilates class. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like copper on my tongue. I had to move. My hands, surprisingly steady now fueled by pure adrenaline, pulled my smartphone from my cardigan pocket. I quickly made sure the flash was off and snapped clear photos of every single page in the folder. The email, the medical brochure with Chloe's notes, the appraisal. I slipped the folder perfectly back under the heavy leather blotter, making sure the edges were aligned exactly as I had found them. I closed the desk drawer, smoothed down my sweater, and stepped out of the study just as I heard the key turn in the front door lock. By the time Chloe walked into the kitchen, tossing her yoga mat onto the bench, I was standing by the sink calmly rinsing a teacup. "Oh, you're up," she said, sounding faintly disappointed. She opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water. "I thought you'd be napping. You've been looking so tired lately, Evelyn." "I have plenty of energy, thank you," I said, keeping my voice even. I didn't look at her directly. I didn't trust what she might see in my eyes. When Mark came home, too, hours later the three of us sat down for dinner. Chloe had ordered takeout from an expensive Thai place, paid for, no doubt, from the joint account I still helped fund occasionally. I watched Mark as he ate. I watched the way he laughed at Chloe's stories, the way he casually asked me about my garden. He looked so normal, so relaxed. "Mark," I said quietly, interrupting a story Chloe was telling about a girl in her exercise class. He looked up, a noodle dangling from his chopsticks. "Yeah, Mom? I had a strange call today." I lied, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "Someone from a real estate agency. They asked if we were preparing to list the house. Have you mentioned anything to anyone? Maybe at work?" The silence that fell over the dining table was absolute. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. Chloe's posture went completely rigid. Her eyes darted to Mark. Mark swallowed hard. A faint flush crept up his neck, settling on his cheeks. He set his chopsticks down. "A real estate agency? No. Why would I do that? They probably just pulled your number from some public registry, Mom. You know how aggressive those housing flippers are right now." He looked right into my eyes and lied. He didn't even stumble over the words. "You're right," I murmured, taking a sip of water. "Just a telemarketer, I suppose." I knew then that I had lost him. The boy I raised was gone, replaced by the man sitting across from me, who was waiting for me to lose my mind so he could cash in. After dinner, I excused myself to my bedroom, claiming a headache. I locked the door behind me. The numbness was finally starting to wear off, replaced by a slow, burning resolve. They thought I was a fragile, forgetful old widow. They thought I would quietly fade into the background. I walked to the back of my closet and pulled down an old, dusty shoebox from the top shelf. Inside were Arthur's old business cards and contacts. I sifted through the yellowed paper until I found the thick, black card I was looking for. Richard Vance, Estate Law and Asset Protection. Richard was a shark. He was the attorney Arthur had hired 20 years ago to handle a vicious corporate dispute. Arthur used to say, if you ever need to burn a bridge while standing on it, Richard is the man who brings the gasoline. I looked at the clock. It was 8:30 p.m. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. Vance Law Group. After hours answering service. A voice crackled through the speaker. Yes, I said, my voice cold and hard. This is Evelyn Hayes. Tell Mr. Vance I need an urgent appointment tomorrow morning. I'm preparing to dismantle an inheritance. The offices of Vance Law Group smelled exactly as I remembered from 20 years ago. Expensive leather, lemon polish, and the quiet, intimidating scent of money. Richard Vance had aged. His hair was completely silver now, but his eyes still held that sharp, calculating gleam of a predator assessing its territory. I sat in the plush leather chair across from his massive oak desk, my phone placed between us. I had already shown him the photos. Richard tapped a heavy gold pen against his notepad. It's a classic strategy, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. They filed the petition for conservatorship under the guise of concern for your well-being. They use the forgetfulness, which she is clearly manufacturing, as evidence. Once a judge grants your son power of attorney, they can liquidate the house too, pay for your care facility. Which, of course, leaves them with a massive surplus of cash. A tight, hot band tightened around my ribs. Hearing it spoken aloud by a professional made it disgustingly real. Can they win? Not a chance, Richard said, sliding my phone back to me. First, you are perfectly lucid. A 5-minute evaluation with an independent neurologist will prove that. Second, the fact that your daughter-in-law wrote a literal script on a medical brochure proves malicious intent. But defending yourself in court is messy, Evelyn. It's public, it's humiliating, and it takes time. I don't want to defend myself, I said, leaning forward. My voice was quiet, stripped of any maternal softness. I want to remove the target entirely. And I want them out of my house. Richard smiled. It was not a kind smile. Then we don't fight the conservatorship. We make it completely useless. For the next 2 hours, we built a fortress. Richard explained the mechanics of an irrevocable living. Trust. By transferring the deed of my house, my savings, and Arthur's life insurance policy into the trust, I would technically own nothing in my name. I would be the trustee, managing it all. But if anyone ever tried to claim I was incompetent, the secondary trustee, Richard's firm, would take over to protect the assets. They can declare you incompetent all they want, Richard explained, drafting the paperwork. But Mark will have power of attorney over an empty vault. And as for the estate when you pass? Leave $10,000 to Mark, I instructed, not blinking. If I leave him nothing, he can contest the will. If I leave him a specific, small amount, it proves I didn't forget him. I simply chose not to fund him. The rest goes to the local animal shelter and the community library. I signed the preliminary documents. The scratching of the pen on the thick paper was the most satisfying sound I had heard in months. When I returned home, the atmosphere had shifted. With Thanksgiving only a week away, Chloe was in high gear. She had invited her parents, wealthy, pretentious people who had always looked down on Arthur and me for living in the suburbs rather than the city. I walked into the kitchen to find Chloe standing on a step stool, packing my antique china into a cardboard box. "What are you doing?" I asked, dropping my purse on the counter. Chloe didn't flinch. "Oh, Evelyn, I was just making some room. We need the cabinet space for the new platters I bought for Thanksgiving. You hardly ever use these old things anyway. I thought I'd pack them up to keep them safe." She was boxing up my life while I was still living it. "Put them back," I said. Chloe stopped, holding a delicate gold-rimmed saucer. She looked down at me, and for the first time, the sugary facade completely dropped. Her eyes were cold, hard chips of flint. "Evelyn," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its forced sweetness. "Let's be realistic. You're struggling to manage this place. Mark and I are doing our best to help you transition. but you have to cooperate. She was testing the waters, pushing to see if I would break, if I would yell or act unhinged so she could record it, or tell Mark about my episode. I felt my pulse thumping steadily against my collarbone. I looked up at her, offering a blank, pleasant expression. "You're right, Chloe. We all need to prepare for the future. Just leave the box on the counter. I'll sort through it later." She looked confused by my easy surrender, but she stepped down, a victorious smirk playing on her lips. "Good. Glad we're on the same page." I went up to my room and waited. The final trust documents, along with the official 30-day eviction notice I had asked Richard to draft, were being mailed to the house via certified delivery. I had tracked the package. It was scheduled to arrive on Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving. But on Wednesday afternoon, I was in the backyard when I heard the distinct sound of the mail truck pulling away. I hurried to the front porch, only to see the mailbox standing open and completely empty. Through the sheer curtains of the living room window, I saw Chloe sitting on the sofa, holding a thick priority mail envelope with Vance Law Group printed clearly in the corner. She was sliding her manicured finger under the flap. A sharp spike of adrenaline pierced my chest as I stood on the porch, watching Chloe slide her manicured fingernail under the flap of the Vance Law Group envelope. If she saw those documents now, the element of surprise would be completely destroyed. She would call her own lawyers. Or worse, she and Mark would physically refuse to leave the house, dragging me into a prolonged eviction battle. I pushed the front door open. The hinges gave a soft, familiar squeak. Chloe froze, her fingers still wedged under the thick paper. She looked up, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "Mail's here," she said breezily, though her voice was slightly higher than usual. "Looks like you got something from a law firm, Evelyn. Is everything okay?" I didn't rush toward her. I didn't snatch it. I walked slowly into the living room, wiping my gardening-soiled hands on my apron, projecting an aura of nervous, elderly embarrassment. "Oh dear," I breathed out, letting my shoulders slump. I reached out and gently slid the envelope from her grasp. I was hoping that wouldn't arrive while Mark was home. Chloe's eyes narrowed. "Why? What is—" I looked away, fixing my gaze on the floorboards, playing the part of the ashamed mother to absolute perfection. It's from Arthur's old firm. They handle my medical proxies. My doctor insisted I update them after I forgot to turn off the stove last month. I don't want Mark to see it. It will only worry him." Chloe's posture instantly relaxed. A flicker of genuine delight crossed her features. Medical proxies. A doctor's concern. It played exactly into her narrative. "Of course, Evelyn," she said, her voice dripping with sudden, artificial sympathy. "I completely understand. I won't say a word to Mark. You should go put that somewhere safe." "Thank you, Chloe," I whispered, clutching the envelope to my chest. I walked upstairs, went into my bedroom, and locked the door. I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands shaking so violently I could barely open the envelope myself. Inside was the finalized, irrevocable living trust, fully executed. And beneath it, printed on crisp, terrifyingly official legal paper, was the 30-day notice to vacate the premises. The trap was set. Thanksgiving Day arrived with a flurry of chaotic energy. Chloe had taken over my kitchen completely. She had hired a private chef to prepare the turkey and sides, deeming my traditional family recipes too rustic for her parents. Her parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance, no relation to my shark of a lawyer, thankfully, arrived at 4 o'clock. Richard was a man who wore ascots in the suburbs, and Eleanor had the kind of tightly pulled face that suggested she had not experienced a genuine emotion since the late 90s. "Evelyn, darling." Eleanor air-kissed my cheek, smelling of gin and expensive perfume. "So generous of you to let Mark and Chloe stay in your little house while they look for something more suitable." "It's my pleasure, Eleanor." I smiled, leading them into the dining room. I watched Mark pour the wine. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes prominent. He kept glancing nervously at Chloe, anticipating her needs, terrified of doing something wrong. A part of me, that deep, primal maternal instinct, wanted to pull him aside and shake him. I wanted to ask him when he had become so weak. But the memory of his signature on that appraisal form quickly hardened my heart. We sat down at the table. The crystal water goblets caught the warm glow of the chandelier. The private chef brought out the food, and the polite, hollow chatter of polite society filled the room. I sat quietly at the head of the table, my fingers resting on my lap, tracing the crisp, sharp edge of the manila envelope hidden beneath my linen napkin. And then, Mark raised his glass. "To family," he said. "To family?" Chloe echoed, offering her camera-ready smile. "And to Evelyn for being so accommodating." My breathing was steady, rhythmic. I pulled the envelope from my lap and placed it directly on top of Chloe's expensive charger plate. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the soft jazz playing in the background. "I have something for you, Chloe, for both of you." Chloe tore the flap open. She pulled out the single sheet of thick legal paper. I watched her eyes scan the first line. The color drained from her face so fast, she looked as though she might faint. The polite smile fractured, then shattered completely. Mark frowned, leaning over to look at the paper. "Chloe? What is it? Is it the down payment?" Chloe couldn't speak. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her hands were trembling so badly the paper rattled. I took a slow sip of my ice water, the cold glass grounding me in the present moment. I looked directly at my son, and then at his wife. "Why don't you read it aloud to the table, Chloe?" I suggested, my voice calm, polite, and completely devoid of mercy. The silence in the dining room was so absolute you could hear the soft, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Chloe remained frozen, her mouth slightly ajar, the eviction notice trembling in her perfectly manicured fingers. "Chloe?" Mark prompted again, his voice tight with rising panic. He reached over and pulled the document from her hands. His eyes scanned the legal header, then dropped to the bold, capitalized letters in the center of the page. "Notice to vacate premises." Mark looked up at me, his brow furrowed in genuine bewilderment. "Mom, what is this? An eviction notice? Is this some kind of bad joke?" "I assure you, Mark, I have never been more serious," I said, cutting into a slice of roasted turkey with slow, deliberate precision. "You both have 30 days to find a new residence, though given the circumstances, I would prefer it if you expedited the process." Eleanor, Chloe's mother, let out a scandalized gasp. "Evelyn, what on earth is the meaning of this? You are throwing your own son out on Thanksgiving." "No, Eleanor," I corrected gently, setting down my knife. "I am protecting my assets from a hostile takeover." I turned my gaze back to my son. I found the folder in the study, Mark, the petition for conservatorship, the medical brochures detailing my dementia, and the property appraisal form, the one with your signature on it. All the color vanished from Mark's face. He looked exactly as he had at 7 years old when I caught him breaking the neighbor's window, terrified and guilty. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, breathless sound came out. "Evelyn, you're confused." Chloe suddenly blurted out. Her voice was shrill, desperate. She looked at her parents, trying to maintain her narrative. "Mom, Dad, she's been having these episodes. Paranoia, making things up. This is exactly why we were looking into medical." I photographed every single page. I interrupted, my voice slicing through her lie like a steel blade. I showed them to Richard Vance, a real estate attorney, not the one you two hired. "My home, my savings, and your father's life insurance are now sitting safely inside an irrevocable living trust. I own nothing on paper. I control it all as the trustee. But if you ever try to declare me incompetent, a corporate law firm takes over. You will never see a single dime." Chloe's father, a man who built his entire life on reputation and social standing, placed his linen napkin on the table. He looked at his daughter, his expression hardening into pure disgust. "Chloe, is this true? Were you trying to declare Evelyn incompetent to take her house?" "Dad, it's not what it sounds like. The market is terrible, and this house is too big for her." "Enough," her father snapped, pushing his chair back. He looked at me, a deep flush of humiliation on his neck. "Evelyn, I am deeply sorry. Eleanor, get your coat. We are leaving." "Dad, please," Chloe begged, but her parents were already walking out of the dining room. The heavy thud of the front door closing echoed like a gavel striking a sound block. Mark sat completely still, staring at the tablecloth. The realization of what he had lost, not just the money, but me, was finally settling over him. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Chloe said, she said you were struggling. She said we needed to protect the equity before you needed professional care." I didn't want to do it, I swear. I listened to her. I looked at my son. I loved him, but looking at him now, I felt only a profound, exhausting pity. You didn't protect me, Mark, I said softly. You chose the easiest path. You signed your name. You have 30 days. Please make sure you clean the guest suite before you hand over the keys. I stood up, picked up my glass of wine, and walked out of the dining room, leaving them sitting alone in the wreckage they had created. 3 months later, the house was mine again. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in early March. I stood on the back porch holding a mug of Earl Grey, watching the first green shoots of the daffodils push through the thawing soil. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the lonely, heavy quiet I had felt after Arthur died. It was a vibrant, breathing silence. It was the sound of freedom, Mark called occasionally. Our conversations were brief, polite, and painfully superficial. They had moved into a cramped, overpriced apartment across town. According to him, Chloe was deeply unhappy. I felt no obligation to fix it. My job as a mother was to raise him to be a man. His choices as a man were his own to carry. I took a sip of my tea, feeling the warm morning sun on my face. Later today, I had a meeting with a travel agent to discuss a 2-week garden tour through Tuscany. My bags weren't packed yet, but for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly where I was going.